This is Scotland, where the land is a part of who we are. It connects us. It sustains us. It's vital, therefore, that we look after it. 6 world-leading institutes have come together to do just that, with funding provided by the Scottish Government. Called SAFARI, which stands for Scottish Environment, Food and Agriculture Research Institutes, their pioneering research aims to improve our food production, but not at the expense of our environment. Their wide-ranging research covers many global challenges, from climate change to food security, echoing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Research has highlighted the importance of exploring nature and maintaining the diversity of plant life around the globe. One focus of SAFARI's work is the humble potato. It may be a key part of our nation's diet, but every year our potatoes come under threat from a constantly evolving, devastating disease, potato blight. By crossbreeding commercial varieties with more resilient wild potatoes, our scientists are keeping one step ahead of potato blight. Soil is fundamental to the food we grow. SAFARI scientists are testing new ways to reduce the amount of chemical fertilisers used on crops. Barley grows better with nitrogen. Pulses like beans and peas put nitrogen back into the soil, naturally. By mimicking nature and growing different types of crops together, they are significantly reducing the need for artificial fertilisers and helping farmers to save resources. When it comes to livestock, SAFARI's collaborative research is helping farmers to breed healthier, more disease-resistant livestock. By developing new vaccines, target testing livestock and keeping detailed records of each animal's progress, the need for unnecessary treatments, such as with antibiotics, can be dramatically reduced. This is better for the livestock and us, lowering the risk of antimicrobial resistance and the amount of chemicals in our environment and our food chain. Scotland is rarely short of water, but a clean and accessible water supply for all should never be taken for granted. Here and around the world, a dangerous waterborne parasite called Cryptosporidium can be fatal to both livestock and humans. SAFARI scientists have shown the parasite can be managed by keeping livestock and wildlife away from our water sources. The ultimate aim of this research is to produce a vaccine that will save lives right around the world. Research into our diet is showing how important plant diversity is to our health and well-being. Heart disease and diabetes are major health issues in Scotland. SAFARI scientists are growing old varieties of oats and barley that contain more beta-glucan fibre than modern cereals. Dietary tests have shown that beta-glucan fibre mops up cholesterol and so helps in the fight against heart disease. Scientists have also found that an enzyme in the native Scottish blaeberry can help diabetics regulate their blood sugar. The race is now on to develop a new kind of superberry, one that combines the benefits of both commercial and wild varieties. The new berry will be good for all of us, but especially diabetics. In an uncertain world, it makes sense for us to grow more of our food locally. Not only is it more reliable, it's also better for our economy, offering vital support for our rural communities. By joining forces, SAFARI are proud to be making a real difference. Their research is boosting our economy and helping to solve today's tough challenges across food, agriculture and the environment. With your continued support, SAFARI are working together for a better future for everyone.
Thank you for joining us for Achieving a Just Transition for Rural Scotland. This panel debate has been convened by the Scottish Environment, Food, Agricultural Research Institute, SAFARI, and SAFARI delivers the strategic research component of the Scottish Government strategic research portfolio in environment, land, agriculture, food and rural communities research. And SAFARI Gateway is the knowledge exchange, innovation and impact centre for that strategic research portfolio. This panel debate brings together policymakers, community representatives, individuals within rural communities, researchers, activists, business from across rural Scotland to explore the opportunities and challenges on the road to net zero, with a specific focus on what a just transition means for individuals, communities that live and work within rural and island Scotland. Today we are joined by an audience of over 210 online and an audience, live audience with us here in the room. And there will be opportunities for those online to ask questions, and we've already had questions coming in, thank you very much, through the Slido option on your online connection. We will also be taking questions from within the room as well as from Slido to make sure this is a fully interactive debate. Now, in the challenge of a just transition and the opportunities for it in rural Scotland are wide, challenging and complex. And to take us through the issues and the opportunities, we have a panel drawn from expertise across rural Scotland. And on my left, I'll introduce the panel. I'd like to start by introducing Dr. Jane Atherton. She's the manager of the Rural Policy Centre at Scotland's Rural College, and her research focuses on rural and regional development issues with a particular focus on rural economies and businesses. She looks at rural policy, policy-making process, and urban-rural interactions, and the linkages and demographic changes for rural areas. She has undertaken projects for the UK Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, for the Scottish Government, for the European Commission, and for a range of local authorities and enterprise agencies. Further to my left, Fiona Morrison is the acting chair for the Scottish Rural Action Board. She is the founder and director of Community Development Lens, which shines our lens on islands and rural communities in Scotland, a project which supports young people in reviving remote communities. Currently, she is working on the Smart Islands project, which promotes rural and island voices from Scotland and Ireland on the topic of population, housing, infrastructure, language, culture and tourism. Fiona has worked in partnership with SAFARI on the Islands Revival Project and has been the founding member of the Scottish Women's Enterprise Group and is one of only 2 women from Scotland to sit on the Westminster Government Advisory Body. She has also started her own business using local island produce, coordinated a pan-European project to increase entrepreneurship by women in rural areas, and has even managed a radio station and contemporary traditional Scottish music group. Jim Hume, further to my left, is a board member and non-executive director of Scotland's Rural College and director of public affairs and communications at Support in Mind Scotland and convener of the National Rural Mental Health Forum, which mobilises action for people affected by mental illness. Jim established and convenes the National Rural Mental Health Forum and works with the scope of economic development, social development and government policy. He is also an honorary associate of the British Veterinary Association and a past member of the Scottish Parliament's Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee. Third on the panel is Jane Craigie, a chartered marketeer with over 25 years of experience in marketing within the agri-food sector. She is a member of the executive board of the International Federation of Agricultural Journalists and the Council of the British Guild of Agricultural Journalists. She is a board member for Lantra, a Scottish government-supported business that helps individuals receive training and qualifications in land-based and environmental work. And Jane is also bringing the perspective of youth into the debate as a director and co-founder of the Rural Youth Project, recently having completed a Rural Youth Project manifesto, which highlights issues for young people within rural communities. Further to my left, Jackie Brereton is the CEO of GrowBiz. She is also the chair of Rural Perth and Kinross Leader Local Action Group, vice chair of the Women's Enterprise Scotland, and a member of the National Council of Rural Advisors. She has more than 30 years' experience in business and enterprise, including a stint as CEO of the UK's first women's enterprise centre, Wellpark. She's passionate about helping people to realise their potential through enterprise and is inspired by the innovation and creativity, particularly from young people and women and those living in rural areas. Finally, Dr. Mags Curry is a health and well-being social scientist and human geographer in the Social, Economic and Geographical Science Group at the James Hutton Institute. She works within the theme of society, institutions and governance, and is interested in how different spaces, such as rural communities, impact the health and well-being of people and the role of policy and interventions within these spaces. Mags works with an interdisciplinary team to exchange knowledge with policymakers and public bodies and the third sector to find ways that services can be delivered in rural areas and to investigate resilience and to understand the balance and interplay between people and their natural environments. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome your panel today. To start, I would like to open to the panel to provide a brief view of just transition and the issues that raises and the opportunities that raises for them in brief. And I'll turn to Jane first, if I may. Jane.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you for the invite to be here today. As I'm up first, which I think is probably an advantage, I thought I'd focus on 5 general points, which hopefully my fellow panel members will pick up on more detail. The first is about the importance and significance of rural. So I attended an OECD event on Tuesday where they launched their new rural agenda for climate action. And several speakers referred to the importance of rural across the OECD. So rural areas make up 82% of the landmass of OECD countries and 30% of the population. In Scotland, rural areas make up 98% of the landmass and just under 20% of the population. So if we ignored rural areas in the just transition in Scotland, we'd be ignoring the vast majority of the country's landmass and about 1 in 5 of its population. So given that importance and significance of rural, in order to ensure that rural opportunities and challenges are taken into account at national and regional policy-making levels, we need to ensure that climate, net zero, circular economy policies, strategies, and funding streams do not disadvantage rural individuals, communities and businesses in the same way that we do now in Scotland with regard to islands through the Islands Community Impact Assessment process. In fact, what we need is to move away from spatially blind policies for all policies to be place-based, meaning that they're flexible enough to facilitate and support appropriate actions at the local level. And to do this rural and indeed island proofing, we need a comprehensive and up-to-date evidence base on the impacts of climate change, but also the impacts of climate change policies. And crucially, that evidence base needs to include quantitative data, but also information from local areas, the lived experiences of local people. My third point is around the significant potential of rural areas to contribute to achieving net zero, and with that, the potential for new jobs and income sources to be created. But we need to make sure that local people can take advantage of those. So instead, perhaps, of the traditional view amongst some that rural areas are unsustainable, we need to talk about them, think about them, act and appropriately on their tremendous reserves of land, air, water, natural resources, peatlands, biodiversity, space, food, well-being, etc., etc. So rural areas can be the champion of many of the initiatives that we need in this fundamental transition to net zero. But that needs rural communities to be empowered. Which brings me to my fourth point. There is a real need for local capacity building and a deep and real involvement of rural people alongside perhaps technical knowledge and investment from outside. We need to engage individuals and groups that haven't engaged previously. The just transition needs to be designed and delivered by everyone, no matter where they live or their level of income. That capacity building might include skills development, advisory services, investment, as I say, using local stakeholders to build mechanisms through which everyone can be engaged. Perhaps we need, in addition to rural proofing, to think about exclusion proofing or community proofing. Community-led engagement is key, not tick-box consultation. And my final point is about the challenges to achieving net zero in rural locations. Practical challenges, perhaps, around the location of wind farms or solar panels, but also challenges relating to some of the wicked problems that we know exist in rural places, which, to the most part, comes down to lack of choice. At the moment, with colleagues, I'm doing work for Scottish Government on child poverty, and we've heard stories of rural parents who have to choose between having a hot meal for tea and having hot water to run a bath for their kids at bedtime, because their energy costs are so high, their house is so energy inefficient. We've heard examples of parents wanting to take on employment to get off benefits, but the only way they can do that is by running a private car, because the public transport doesn't run. When it does run, it's at the wrong time, it takes too long, they can't get childcare, it's too expensive. So we need to ensure that decisions on policies and roadmaps to get us to net zero targets in Scotland are taken with the full understanding of this context in rural places. And that takes us back to that need for rural proofing, meaningful checking that all policies are fit for purpose for rural areas as well as our towns and cities. And just to finish with the words of the Just Transition Commission, climate action, fairness and opportunities must go together for everyone, no matter where they live.
Thank you, Jane. That gave a really good overview of where we're at in rural Scotland. I'd just like to build a little on what the OECD said, because they also said that rural areas have a rich variety of Indigenous traditions and culture, and rural places are, in short, vital to the prosperity and well-being of all people and our society. Added to that, a recent report came out just recently from the Food and Global Security Network, and they've just reported that soil should be politically recognised as a strategic asset, as its ability to produce food underpins peace and civil stability. Scotland's birth rate is the lowest now since the 1800s. We're not alone. Italy has the lowest birth rate in Europe, and Germany's birth rate is falling too. But when we're talking about a skilled population to deliver for rural Scotland, we need to bear that in mind. Who lives there and what are we doing? So, do we need a vision for rural Scotland? If we want Scotland to develop its full potential, given that so much of what we need to enable us to thrive sustainably, we need to be able to facilitate people to live there. I think if we have a vision for rural and island Scotland, some of the things we need to consider as a country are, do we want to be able to feed ourselves? 42% of the food into the UK is imported. So Scotland has a huge opportunity there. Do we want to do that? Reduce food miles and so on? We can come on and talk about that later. I think we're all agreed that we want to be renewable in terms of our energy, and I think as a country we're well on our way to achieving that. And do we want to own our assets, the assets that Jane referred to, of fresh water, coastal foreshore, the land itself, the power, the renewable power, the just everything that is supported on that, and the food? Who owns that? And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Somebody said the other day at one of the meetings I was at, people in cities are too far away from the harvest, and they don't know how good or bad the harvest was. And that's a real issue when you think of our 80% of people living in urban areas in Scotland. And many years ago, I worked with a lady in health education, and she told me in an urban context that many of the children thought that chocolate milk came from brown cows. Now, James Rebanks is an English farmer, you may have heard of, and he is reaching the great unwashed in terms of land and biodiversity and so on. And he's able to communicate about how important it is to farm and biodiversity being embedded in that. But as he said, he was the reason he did that and has written these books is because people did not know where their food came from. So a great opportunity, huge swathes of land. Scotland really can lead the way on this, and I'll talk later about the skills that are required to enable us to deliver if we agree this vision is really important.
Yes, thanks, Stephen. I'm just going to concentrate on a couple of points, really, just in the opening remarks. Hopefully we'll get time for discussions afterwards, and that's just to challenge us all to maybe think out of the normal silos, you know, climate change, whose department is that? And also to just consider how communities can really be empowered really to make decisions for them to come up with answers for climate change. It was briefly mentioned that I set up and convened the National Rural Mental Health Forum. That's about 230 organisations from all sort of sectors, government departments, health organisations, communities, research institutes get involved now and again, and businesses. Hope that's not a dirty word, but they do employ a lot of people. And they are all dedicated to tackle mental health. Some have that expertise, some research to try and find out some of the answers to the questions, and some want to do something but don't know where to start. So that's seen a lot of communities and businesses come up with their solutions, and that's really important. I think we have to think about that re-transition. So it's important that solutions come from the ground up in the community, for businesses, within the businesses. I call a business a community as well. And the government, I think, can empower that from an upwards way. So, as I said, climate change should not just be seen as an issue just for environmental directorates or energy directorates or the agricultural division. So we need to think outside those silos. Think about the health and well-being agenda. Eco-anxiety is a new challenge that we have. I was brought up, believe it or not, old enough to remember some of the Cold War. Nobody's not believing that. Anyway, brought up with anxiety that somebody will press a red button and I'll see a big flashing light and that'll be that. The new anxiety is eco-anxiety, and I think we have to recognise that. And that's poor for your mental health, of course. Wildfires and flooding on a pouring wet day in Glasgow damages homes, it destroys homes, it takes lives, and that of course leads to trauma and damaged mental health. So there's all that that union there between the climate change and the health agenda. But we also need to protect our nature and manage environments and landscapes, consider the opportunities that they hold. Many people with lived experience of mental health access that environment. They look to be supported before they get into a crisis, when NHS services would kick in, and they do a fantastic job. But if you talk to people through research or just through your work, then you'll realise that people with lived experience of poor mental health look to be supported at the early stages in a bespoke way to them. And some of that is accessing the environment, benefits to their health and well-being. And also early adoption of social prescribing is starting to happen in Scotland, very early stages, whereby you would go to a doctor, a GP or another health professional, and rather than the chemicals or the drugs, which can help people, please don't say it's wrong to take drugs. It does help many, many people. It can be a chemical imbalance, so let's be clear. But social prescribing is getting more and more used by health professionals. So if we don't have that environment to social prescribe people into, whether it's a natural or a managed landscape, then that's, I think, what we have to consider. So just in deliberations, just consider the health and well-being agenda as well, because that can go a long way to face some of the inequalities that we have in rural Scotland regarding mental health and well-being. Lots of research done, all with lived experienced people, and as I said, they're clear about their views, but a lack of anonymity, a lack of services, because they tend to be centrally located in rural areas, means that rather than putting more services in there, we go back to using the environment to help those who maybe experience mental health and well-being, and get into early prevention of people getting worse rather than treating people when they get really bad. So just that's my couple of points. Listen to the communities, empower the communities, and make it everyone's business to tackle mental health and well-being.
Hello, everybody. This is a really powerful point in time. I think we're all feeling it, and the urgency with which these conversations that have been happening here and the publicity that they've got can only be a good thing. People are at the heart of the changes that we need to make in rural Scotland at individual, household, community and business level. We all need to listen more, to care more, and most importantly, do more. How can our net zero transition be just? Only if we involve people and communities, taking them on the journey, being at the heart of creating the change, the good, the difficult, but importantly, the creative. I'm showing up here for our vibrant, our brilliant, and our inspiring rural young people. My team's mission is to better understand, represent, and encourage them in leadership, enterprise, and activism. We've seen they're possible during the pandemic, setting up new businesses, helping their communities, and adapting to a new normal, something that will be really important as we move into a just transition. Net zero is their future, and it's wrapped in tackling the endemic challenges of housing, expensive, limited, poor in rural areas, we're repeatedly told, careers and jobs. So how do we create meaningful careers in the places they love, rather than them having to work multiple jobs, earning 20% than their urban peers? People like Amy, who lives on Jura, and she has a development, or had a development job, which she gave up for Isla and Jura. She had to have 2 cars, one on Isla, one on Jura, to do her job. And how do we tackle the transport issues that are endemic, where 78% of young rural people say they need a car to live where they do, and connectivity and services? Elders don't have the answers, and it's frightening for us, which is why we have so many young activists showing up every day to shout about what they want, what we need. Young people have an innate environmental consciousness. Those who can drive change have the ideas, the energy, and they take action, importantly, if they're given the permission to engage. And if they don't get the permission, they'll engage and do it anyway. We need to harness that energy. They can be incredibly entrepreneurial and see things that us as older people don't see so easily. The net zero transition will create conflict because it means change and tough decisions. It'll be harder for those with more to lose from their now, and I call it a comfortable inertia. If you're comfortable, often you're inert. We have to be prepared for this and the conflict that it will cause. Young people are disarming, they're compelling, they're uniting, and they're disruptive. They have the ideas, the energy, and have shown that they will take action. They can't understand why action is so difficult. Fairness and inclusion. Those who want to and can't access decision-making and take action, those who won't engage and change their behaviours, those who want to make change, personal and at community and business level, and can, but also those who can't. Who will be left behind in all of this? Who will have a just transition? The pandemic has fostered stale thinking, a lack of ambition, and difficulties for leaders to make differences and to drive change. Leadership now is more crucial than ever. Speaking up for those who can't, understanding their position, having the difficult conversation, and most importantly and vitally working together. And I love this quote. We have a powerful potential in our youth, and we must have the courage to change old ideas and practices so that we may direct their power into good ends.
Thanks, Jane. Hello. It's always a disadvantage to come 5th on the panel because everything else has been said, but I want to focus on 2 areas particularly. One is the role of enterprise to achieve a just transition in rural areas in Scotland, and the second is how we resource communities and enterprises in rural areas and the inequalities that exist. I think the role of micro-enterprises and small businesses in rural areas is often underestimated and understated. It's often not even measured. And yet we have the most diverse and innovative range of businesses in rural Scotland, in probably proportionately in any part of the UK, certainly. And they cover so many different sectors. So the traditional sectors that people think of rural, as in agricultural, fishing, forestry, and land-based, are actually proportionately less economically contributing than the vast majority of other businesses in every diverse sector you can think of. So we have a huge range of fantastically creative businesses in rural Scotland. We've got businesses obviously in tourism, including a lot of new businesses coming together under responsible and green tourism. Health and social care is a growing area. And help supporting these, finding the right means of supporting and financing these businesses and encouraging people to create their own jobs, the young people that Jane was talking about, I think is going to be absolutely critical going forward. Because there's an interesting, I think, new ethos for people, and maybe particularly younger people. But since the pandemic, and my organisation works with lots of different rural enterprises, we're hearing much less about people wanting to set up the next growth business. We're hearing about people who want to set up businesses that are going to provide essential services, that are going to basically do good, they're going to earn a living for the people involved, they're going to be more sustainable in lots of ways, and we've got to accommodate those. And at the moment, our business supports services and interface tends to focus more on the high growth big businesses. And much as everybody wants to have the next Amazon in Scotland, it's probably not a good thing from a just transition and sustainable growth. I think we need to be supporting lots and lots and lots of very small businesses who will connect and collaborate and work together and create the next economy, the next communities that we want to see in rural Scotland. So the second issue is how do we resource these? How do we fund these? And at the moment, there's huge inequalities in the way rural areas can access funding, including businesses. So one of the key sources of that funding has been the LEADER programme, which was EU funded. It's just coming to an end, the last programme, and obviously we won't be taking part in the next LEADER programme. But that entire LEADER programme, which was responsible for a lot of rural development, was sometimes often the only resource that people could turn to, was only worth about 80 million over 5 to 6 years. Scottish Enterprise, one of our key economic development agencies, who doesn't have a big rural budget, gets 3 times that every single year. That's just one example of how basically rural areas and the rural economy is under-resourced, and it's something that we have to address if we're seriously going to have just transition and make the most of the new ideas and new economies going forward, and all the innovation that we see on a daily basis, that huge entrepreneurial energy, which is actually counterintuitively emerged since the pandemic. So I think those are the 2 key things that highlight and hopefully be able to discuss in more detail. Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. Obviously, I'm last here. We're at a point of massive societal change, not just in response to climate change, but also COVID and Brexit. So these events have and will continue to have and require everyone to adapt our lifestyles and our livelihoods. So we've heard about some of the wicked rural problems that Jane talked about that could present a danger that rural gets left behind. However, I see this transition as an opportunity for a more spatially just chance to address these problems and recognise and build on the rural advantages that we've been hearing about. So in doing so, it's important that rural communities and their differences and diversity are recognised if a truly just transition takes place. And by justice in sort of the context of rural, I think in terms of spatial, social, environmental and economic. So currently there's a lot of emphasis in Scottish policy to empower particularly rural and island communities to be resilient, when a truly just transition needs to consider how external support can best be provided to enable or support this process. So for me, a just transition will require us all to work better together, taking the lead from our rural communities. So one of the intended outcomes of this session is to come up with supportive actions for a just transition in rural communities. So I want to share some recent research findings emerging from the Community and Wellbeing Work Package on the current Scottish Government Strategic Research Programme. And this work was undertaken by the James Hutt Institute and SRUC, and aimed to understand the lived experiences of the pandemic in rural and island communities, identify factors that promote resilience in rural and island communities, and consider options of the routes to a medium to long-term recovery process. We interviewed a wide range of rural and island stakeholder interests and contexts, and there were 9 recommendations emerging from that research about what a recovery should look like, and I thought I'd like to share those with you. The first was building on new partnerships and supporting community anchor organisations. Secondly, capitalising and rewarding community spirit. Thirdly, encouraging young people to move to rural and island areas. Fourthly, retaining, enhancing digital connectivity opportunities. Fifthly, strategic partnerships which would deliver place-based solutions. Sixthly, supporting adaptable local businesses. 7, supporting diversification of the rural economy. 8, enhancing the knowledge base of local regional vulnerabilities. And finally, retaining a flexible, targeted and responsive approach to financial support. So to me, a just transition is part of a process of transformational resilience of rural and island communities that recognises that change has to take place, but it can be done in a way that puts the needs and desires of people living and working in rural and island communities first.
Thank you very much, and thank you, panel, for sharing those opening remarks. We've been made aware that some people online are having trouble gaining access, and I believe we're trying to fix that as I speak. So although those people I'm apologising to won't naturally hear what I'm saying, apologies for that. We will continue to answer questions and leave Slido open after the event for up to a week for people to continue to put their questions to the panel for us to answer as the post this event. So if people are having trouble getting in or think of questions that they should have asked at the time, but suddenly it comes to mind after the event, by all means, you're very welcome to put a question to us, and we'll be delighted to answer it, or at least try to answer it. We now come to the opening series of discussion, opening this to the online and physical audience here today. And the first question that we would like to anchor this debate with is, and we've heard so many important issues and opportunities here from the panel already, but to ask really, how important is framing a just transition for rural Scotland? Why do we need to address it? Look at the question panel here, if anyone would like to go first.
I'm happy. I was just going to add, first thought, I'm a glass half full person. I see opportunities everywhere, although this is a wicked set of problems that we are facing. But as a marketer as well, I see a massive opportunity from Scotland. You know, we're a relatively small population on a large landmass, 1 million people living rurally. And a strong green and well-being economy fits really perfectly with Brand Scotland. We already have an iconic global brand, and our country's rural food and tourism opportunities are great. And it builds on the tapestry of resources that we have: forestry, beautiful landscape, the ability to produce great food at very high quality, and land and space for leisure, and the right to access that land. But of course there are very big challenges that have to be resolved for us to achieve that. But they are a lot of the things that my fellow panel members have already raised, like micro businesses, supporting really small micro businesses. You know, an £18,000 turnover for a young person's business is really important. And if that's a really cool, creative business, then that business can spawn others to consider doing the same in that place. So ground up has to be there, and it has to be very much building on the assets that we have and the iconic brand that we already just own. It's ours, which is Brand Scotland.
Just a couple of points. Sorry, Fiona. So to me, it's obviously important that we do transition to a net zero. That's important, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, obviously to ensure that we look after that landscapes that we have, managed landscapes and natural landscapes, that they can also remain to be part of solutions, not just for the lungs of our earth, but also for the health of us humans that live on that earth. But I think in going forward for a just transition, that we have to make sure that others aren't left behind. Index of multiple deprivation is often used. 2/3 of the people that live in Scotland do not live live in deprivation, do not live in an area that's designated as a index of multiple deprivation area, and many of those are in rural Scotland. It's not always a life choice to live in rural Scotland, so when we're talking with some of the policymakers, we have to remind them of that. There is fuel poverty, which is already mentioned. There is health inequalities, access to services are different and bigger challenges. And so if we move to electric vehicles, it might be fine for some of us, and I think I probably could afford an electric vehicle if there were charging points around. But what about those people who can't? We're needing to have those second-hand cars just so they can have their low-wage economy job, if you like, access. So I think we have to make sure that we don't add to the health inequalities and the other inequalities that we have at the moment in rural parts of Scotland.
Thanks, Jim. So I'd just like to ask you all a question, if I may. I realise I might get thrown out of this room, but we might as well start as we mean to go on. Does anybody know where the picture behind me is? Can anybody tell me that? The Kerrang sky. Well done. Gold star to you. Excellent. Very good. Yes, absolutely. Can anybody tell me what's wrong with it? This is where Fiona doesn't get any lunch. But anyway, carry on. Can you tell me what's wrong with it? Yeah? No trees. The tree line, 2,500 feet. Well done. Not one tree to be seen. Anything else? No people. So Scotland, the brand, is very strong, but this is part of it. And this is actually very wrong. Some young people in where I live in Uist were so concerned about how Scotland is being presented without people, empty. And remember, if we're talking about, are we going to feed ourselves? Does that matter? Do we want people to live in Scotland? I look at islands on my shoreline that are no longer lived in. People threw in the towel. Professor Jim Hunter, many years ago, said just because you were not taken by the scruff of the neck and thrown off the land, if the social and economic circumstances were such that you had no choice but to leave, you have essentially been cleared. So who owns that land? I mean, I'll come on to this more later, but who owns the land and what happens on it? I heard Callum MacLeod, the Policy Director for Community Land Scotland, himself originally from Harris, speaking just the other day. And he said, you know, people say it doesn't really matter who owns the land, some people say, but what you do on it. But actually, research by St Andrews University has shown that if you don't have power over your own assets and your own communities, some people have reported having fear of their landowner. In 2021, I ask you. So, I think we have a great opportunity, but we must be careful how we position Scotland. We can talk about tourism, but tourism is only one part of an economic equation, and there are places which are suffering with over-tourism and, frankly, are shut in the winter because they have seasonal jobs and young people can't get houses and so on. So there are huge opportunities with this land. As I say, we just need to say, well, what do we want for rural Scotland to produce in the world, as Jane said before, with Brexit, COVID and climate change being the biggest threat? What we do with our land, if you were living on an island, like my late husband's family did, you look at that island and go, so how do we feed ourselves in a way that is sustainable going forward. You've got no external markets to support you in that context. And therefore, you look at it in terms of a pie chart of sustainability. So the donut economy, the circular economy, call it whatever you like. But considering rural Scotland in that context and the assets we have and how we present them and how they are used, it's important for all of us, every single one of us who live in Scotland.
If I just may echo that really briefly, the point I was going to make was around sort of community ownership of assets. Community Land Scotland have recently put out some research which argued that community landowners were punching above their weight, I think was the terminology they used, in terms of delivering integrated projects. So projects that might not necessarily have climate change objectives at their core, but which deliver jobs and housing and businesses at the local level too. And there's some fantastic examples. And actually, examples that are often seen as radical, and I need to acknowledge my colleague Alexa in the room, who we were having discussions about this, but projects that are often seen as quite radical, but actually we need to scale them up so that the impacts of them are much greater in that sort of integrated way. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Any more points from the panel before I move on? What I'll do at this stage now is open the next. We've heard some challenges and some priorities there. And our next question to the audience and also from online is, what are the priorities then? What would you identify as key priority for a just transition in rural Scotland? What would be your key priority? And if I can turn to online first, we've had a question that has coming, which is affecting, I think, many rural communities, rural towns, rural villages, around what can be done to help fill the empty shop fronts, the empty shops and businesses that were once in small towns with something that is sustainable. I wonder if I can turn to the panel and ask comments on that question.
There's 2 points, and one does relate to mental health and well-being, but if people stop shopping at their shops, shops will close. So I suppose it's looking at those zones that are in planning are zoned for retail, and consider what else we can do with those shops that people don't go to. And what we've found in lots of the work that we do in mental health and well-being is what else is disappearing is places for people to connect. We've seen closures of post offices, banks, etc. in rural areas. And I think there's real opportunities to look at where else we can connect in our rural towns. There are some pubs left open, but that's absolutely not appropriate for everybody. That's the last place that they would go to. Not an advocate for them myself, I'll just add, but there's many others, where that's absolutely not appropriate. So maybe it's a chance to just look at these areas that are zoned for retail, that currently have to be retail, and what else we can do to keep our town centres, village centres vibrant. It's maybe not the answer that they want, but if people don't support shops, they can't stay open. And I think during COVID, we've obviously seen quite a marked shift from going to a shop to going online and pressing a few buttons, and it's there within a day or two.
Thanks. It's really interesting, actually, because if you look at some rural towns, certainly where I live in Perthshire, there's a real vibrancy to them at the moment. So I know that's not the same across the board, but there's some towns who 3 years ago may have had empty units who don't have any empty units left. And that's partly because there's a continued demand for local shopping, so people have kept up that habit that they got through the pandemic. 2, there's new people coming into the area who see entrepreneurial ideas and businesses that they can take into these premises. But the areas that are not doing quite so well are also looking more imaginatively at how they use empty space. And the concept of having connected hubs where you have a space which is used as multi-use, where you could have some workspace in it, some community space, a cafe space, a social enterprise providing some kind of service, but just using more imagination. But one of the things that's going to have to happen is a lot more flexibility from the owners of the retail units in places. We still have an expectation in some areas that people can get 400, 500, 600 and a lot more a month for premises, that there's no demand, and they're not willing, they haven't seen that the whole environment has changed, so flexibility is going to be needed, and that people are not willing to sign for 5 or 10-year leases anymore, that needs to be more flexible. But there's lots of good examples across Scotland of where pop-up shops, sort of collaboratives taking over premises for periods of time, sort of timeshare shops, which I think is quite an interesting concept, where 1 or 2 people take it on for a month and run it like a pop-up shop, and then you get to book it ahead. And I think it's just a case of using our imagination and helping people to make better use of the empty units, and look at what that particular area needs, what the gaps are, proactively help people.
I was just going to add community ownership. You know, I love a lot of the work that the Plunkett Foundation does, which supports, they've got supports community buyouts of premises. There's amazing resources on the Plunkett Foundation's website to access, and we're seeing that happen, that community ownership happen in Scotland. One of the local towns close to me, it's a very rural town, Huntly. A number of banks and shops have closed down, and really big units within the square of Huntly, and the community groups have been buying them up. They're feeling those challenges now. Who comes into those places and spaces? How do you sustain them? What is the right model? So it's not easy community ownership, but it gives the community power to do what they want. It also gives great power to include young people, children, in that journey, to use that space, to use that place. And I think a lot of the things that we've talked about, and Fiona's really passionate about, so heritage and culture and local foods and the heritage of local foods all play their part. But we have to move back to a much more simple way of living, where the community is much more at the heart of how those places and spaces are used. But in order to do that, there's got to be community investment for that to happen.
Yeah, I've got time.
Yes,
Okay.
you have indeed,
I suppose
yeah.
it was just a reflection on that, and the need to provide support to those communities where that's not happening. You know, the town centres where there isn't that sort of level of activity. How do we encourage that to happen? How do we make that happen? And there's no easy answers. I guess it's about working with local stakeholders. It's about working with local businesses and potential business owners to start having those discussions, I suppose, which then lead to action.
Thank you. And any comments from the audience here? Anyone who wants to come back or comment on what they've heard so far? No? Okay, well, sorry. Yeah.
I think often the catalyst is a person. Mm-hmm. It's people. And community ownership is often complex, or community decision making is complex, because some people engage, some don't. But having a couple of people or 3 people, you know, that video that we've all seen on YouTube where one guy starts dancing and then somebody else comes up and joins, you know, unless one person has got the spark to be creative and to come up with something that is meaningful for that place, nothing will happen. Mm-hmm. So it's about putting yourself out there, it's about leadership, and I think if we're going to get a just transition, it's got to be lots of little fires being lit all over Scotland.
Can I pose the question from that? There seems to be across the panel that cooperation, that working between business and communities, individual communities, is crucially important in building up this response to net zero and for a just transition. But in communities where people and resources can be relatively limited over time frames, how do we encourage the succession when that spark, that individual or group of individuals that have driven something, either move away or naturally come to the end of their term of involvement? How do we empower that? Oh, there's the audience. Oh, sorry.
Thanks. Sally Bailey, RESAS. Just based on my experiences in a previous role, working with communities, developing recreational projects, we can't be prescriptive, and there isn't a one-size-that-fits-all, but I think the best thing that we can do is enable communication of shared ideas and different ways of getting to the same endpoint. And social media is a great medium to enable that to happen. And so if people can share their ideas of different pilots, different methodologies to get to a similar endpoint, and that is happening organically through not only sort of communities of place, but also communities of interest as well now, then we can enable people to develop in different ways to get to the same endpoints and successful projects.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, a question from online.
I'm afraid we have had a few online difficulties, but we were given some questions ahead of time because we opened the questions early. And a question that maybe links to this discussion is, should we send experts out to spend time in our communities to enable action that can precipitate change, or should this be left entirely to the locals?
Interesting question. Who wants to take that one first? Yeah.
Well, I feel quite strongly about this, actually. So, undoubtedly, communities can benefit from the knowledge and experience of experts, but there's so many different ways that we can empower communities to develop their own capacity and capability, and to address the issue that we just talked about there about how you protect that and make sure that there's less burnout going forward. And a couple of really interesting examples from just stuff I've been doing recently. Community action planning, I think, can often provide a really good framework for communities to both build their own expertise and their own capability, but also give a fantastic democratic chance for communities to feed into something that they can then have ownership of and they can then prioritise. And we've been able to do some of that in our leader area with some leader and local authority funding. We've now got 8 communities either having formed a community action plan or are in the process of doing it. And that has been a really positive in most cases. It's also quite an interesting process in pulling out some of the tensions within communities, but then at least you've got a framework that you can do something with them. So I would really advocate the concept of community action planning. There's different formats and frameworks that you can follow, but the end result should be something that the whole community feels that it can then see enacted over years to come, and that they've got something to take to funders in order to fund priorities. And that should include resourcing and building capability and capacity. And one other framework I think that we should be looking at developing, and I think it will develop in a rural sense, is the community wealth building concept. So community wealth building is all about keeping more of that energy and expertise within a community. Okay, it's mostly around financing and keeping local business and procurement processes and improving local supply chains, but they all kind of fit in together, because if you can create a good community wealth building framework in an area that also has a community action plan, you could really start seeing some quite powerful things happening and giving a community not just the resources to go forward, but that their own expertise. So going back to the question, I think we shouldn't do sorry, I've forgotten the actual quote about fishermen and teaching people to fish and blah, blah, blah. But you know what I mean. We should be enabling communities to do things for themselves and to have that long-term capability. Just one last point. I think rural communities are benefiting. There's lots of downsides, I've got to say, to the repopulation or the additional population that's going on in rural areas at the moment, because there's downsides around housing, property, etc. But some of the upsides are that there's a real injection of expertise and experience coming into rural areas from people who have made that conscious decision that they want to live rurally, sometimes because of what's happened in the last 18 months, and they want to contribute locally. And if they do that in the right way and fit in with the community rather than try to change the community, that can be really powerful as well. And I think that is quite a dynamic that's going on in Scotland's rural areas at the moment.
I think just generally what we've been talking about relates back to what I was saying about policy focusing on empowerment of communities, and then that places the onus on communities. And I think moving forward we have to share that burden. We need to help communities. We need to better enable communities. We need to all do that together. I think a rural movement is about listening to rural voices, but helping those rural voices be heard, and understanding the different heterogeneity of rural communities, understanding what solutions are right for different places. And going ahead, we really need to think about how not just communities themselves telling us what they want and that that's what they should do, but trying to help build those skills, whether it's the most able communities that can do things for themselves or the least able. So some communities are going to need a lot more support to be able to do that, and that support will need to continue. And then also this idea that when something has happened, whether it be a community buyout, that somehow the communities have become resilient, and that's when it ends, when the support needs to be continued for a long time afterwards, I think. The EU Relocal project that I was involved in, which was thinking about spatial justice in Lewis, and we were comparing to 33 different case studies across Europe, and they weren't just rural, but something that was really, really key to that place-based approach was this intermediary agency. In our case, it was HIGH with their Strengthening Communities programme in Lewis, but that was really, really important to enabling the resilience and those place-based actions.
If I just follow on with the question that was asked online, which was obviously around the experts going into the community, I wonder from our own perspective as well, do you think it's actually about experts learning from the expertise that are in the communities, that the communities are actually our body of expertise? And well, I'll open that.
I'll just put the microphone in my hand, so I may as well carry on. And yeah, we've done quite a bit of work at Supporting Minds Scotland, the mental health charity, to look at supporting people in their communities where there are no services for mental health and there's no carers, etc., etc. And we did quite a bit of work in the Highlands and Islands, the Uist and Benbecula, and also Mull, and it was all about putting in experts, not experts, more facilitators, people to get that going where nothing was happening before, because I think we're all being quite good, and I'm not criticising this, at celebrating where communities have really got together and done some fantastic stuff. But yeah, that's great and must be celebrated. We can all learn from that. But what about those communities that haven't done or don't know the system and how to do that? So facilitating solutions, but making sure you're not parachuting solutions going in is absolutely vital. And sorry, from the recess person in the middle there, sorry for forgetting your name, or not picking up, more likely. We've seen a bit of a revolution. Now, digital's not a revolution for everybody, but for a large amount of people, we've seen huge changes. Our forum, it's a wrong word now, but it's stuck there because it's in government policy now, but the forum isn't just about the meetings, but since COVID, it really has been a lot about that. We meet quarterly. We've met 27 times online for the same 2 hours as we did physically since COVID started. Since last May was the first meeting, because there was so much going on, so much needing shared, research institutes needing to reach out. We've got that reach out, best practice being shared so others can copy that best practice. Now, all the time I'm still worrying, but who's not here? Who's not here? And there's ways of doing that, engaging with those who aren't engaged. But that's the real challenge, not that is easy to do. But But I think there is opportunities there, but don't parachute solutions in, but ensure that we can facilitate communities to come to their solutions for climate change and other issues as well, of course.
Just before we move off the time, I realise we're dwelling on it, but I really want to get, again, one of the questions that are coming in, it's about solutions in local communities. And I'm told they won't mind me mentioning them. This is from the P4, P3 class at Cawdor Primary in Nernshire, in Murray. Sorry, it'll be in Highland, won't it? Yes, Highland, sorry, my apologies. Highland. They've seen a lot of tree felling have been cut down near them. And is there a policy that for every one tree that's chopped down, at least 2 more must be planted? Can we put the minds at rest?
Yeah, so I'll put my ex-Borders Forest trustee hat on. Trees, if you're felling trees, you have to have a felling licence, and part of that felling licence is that you replant. So without knowing the specific trees that are going on about, there'd have to be a pretty special reason why they weren't being replanted, and that could be some development that the councils went over, but obviously I don't know the exact thing. But in Scotland we do have, as a general rule, if you fell trees, you have to replant trees.
And sorry, Jackie's away.
Sorry, I'm an ex-conservator for Scottish Forestry. Yeah, if the trees are being felled, there isn't a rule to necessarily replace one that's felled with 2, but there will be no net loss of forest cover in Scotland, and forest cover has quite ambitious targets to increase cover, and you're absolutely right, you have to have a felling licence to fell more than 5 cubic metres per quarter. So they don't have to worry, unless it was an illegal felling.
Exactly.
Excellent. Thank you very much, and thanks very much to Cawdor Primary for that question, and indeed some others, which we will come on to in different sections. We've obviously talked a lot now about, I suppose, communications, about connectivity within communities, working together, partnerships. One of our questions here is how can rural communities take that voice to influence just transition and net zero agendas? How are they going to have a vocal position in a national agenda?
I think one very obvious way is to be part of rural action. I say that not just because I have a rural action hat on, but just because it is a forum where rural voices can be heard, and I think that's really important. I also think when we were just going back to empowering communities to step up to the plate in many ways, to be able to seize the assets within their communities, I think if we to work back a little bit, I live in an area where we had education for export for many years, and that urban drift has gone on for generations, where somehow to be in the centre in cities was somehow better, that to get on in life you had to go to an urban context. That's changing now, and young economically active adults are saying, actually, with IT, I can work from where I want to work now. I can do the kind of job. So a literacy, a sort of educational literacy of the opportunities linked to local labour market intelligence within the rural community that links how the jobs that will be there in the future, so that young people will come out of education already equipped with the kind of employment opportunities that will be in rural Scotland. And if I think some of the courses are already in place, trying to address various needs. So, for example, well, in the Western Isles, we introduced various courses to address particular needs. So, crofting, local food production, Harris Tweed, maritime skills. Incredible that these things didn't have courses before, but if you want to work in them because they, are an important part of the economy, then we commission the writing of them and so on. But if I think, Community Land Scotland are now I'm on the committee developing curriculum materials for community land ownership and the opportunities that that will present, so that people coming through that whole process will have a literacy understanding of what their asset that they have provides for them. And ScotGem, for example, you've heard on the radio in the last couple of days, absolute desperate shortage of rural GPs and so on. So we know that ScotGem, for example, are now running a course for rural GPs. It's in the 4th or 5th year now, where 25% of that course is steeped in rural general practice, again, to address the gaps. So there is movement. It's just like there are 4 aspects of legislation from the Scottish Government in community right to buy, the Community Land Fund, community asset transfer, and so on. So there are things in place. So, but ensuring that our young people have the right skills and knowledge and accredited knowledge, industry standard qualifications within the fields of net zero. You know, if we can teach Harris Tweed and local food production, we can also teach renewable energy and all those things. We can do that, and it's beholden on us so that our young people don't have to leave because they don't have the jobs. I'll just give you one example. When we were writing the local food production course, one of the people who sat on the panel, because you need to have a panel to demonstrate that, you know, you need those qualifications for SQA to pass the qualifications. And it was with the National Trust for Scotland. They created 8 crofts, but they also had rangers. And the guy from the National Trust for Scotland said, I can't recruit rangers from the local area across the Highlands. Nobody has those skills. I end up recruiting young people from much further afield. And just very recently, I was at an estate in the Highlands. They do a fantastic program with rangers, really good, so good that when they finish their university degree, a lot of those rangers want to come back. The deal is with Exeter. Why isn't it with the Highlands and Islands? You know, I'm not criticising Exeter. I'm sure they're doing a fantastic course. But we should be skilling our young people. I mean, the research we did of 470 young people from Berneray to Eriskay in the Outer Hebrides, 50% of those young people stayed in their community. So they need to have the right skills in the sectors that we need. Health and social care, aquaculture, whatever it is, in a net zero Scotland.
Thanks, Fiona. I suppose for me, to influence an agenda, you need to have a voice or voices in that agenda. And I think it's about rethinking how we think about rural to make for a much more positive narrative about rural and valuing rural in a very different way. It's not only about productivist agriculture, although that's a big part in terms of food production. It's not only about consumption of rural in terms of services. It's about many different values of rural, and particularly in contributing to the just transition. And that voice needs to be, or voices, multiple voices, I think, need to be there on an ongoing basis, not just as a token voice in a particular process. And I think, you know, with Brexit and with the just transition, we have opportunities now for those rural voices to be raised. So, for example, future funding taking over from LEADER, from a Scottish Government perspective, the UK Government funding for levelling up and community renewal. There's an opportunity there for rural voices to be heard in terms of how that funding could and should be distributed and how it could be spent. There's some amazing learning from past programmes about what works well in a community context that can be shared. So it's about, for me, it's about putting that rural voice much more front and central in many of these debates.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Jane's just said, and I think you have to turn it the other way as well, that when consultations and opportunities to hear from rural voices are made, something then has to happen. So I think there's too many examples in the past where there's been pretty intensive consultation opportunities for rural communities, and the National Council Rural Advisor process 3-4 years ago was one of those. And the report that came out from that was largely accepted by government, but the actual actioning that then got caught up in the pandemic. So instead of being seen as being absolutely critical to continue that, and that actually that would support some of the actions that had to take place to enable rural communities to stay afloat and sustaining themselves. That was kind of abandoned. And we're now in another process, which is the 10-year economic transformation strategy, where there's again going to be a strong rural and island strand and voice going into that. But again, it's not about what will appear in a report, it's about how is that then actioned. And I think those of us who've been involved in this for quite a long time, including most of the panel, will remember all sorts of opportunities and reports where it was always said, this mustn't be a report that gathers dust on a shelf. And unfortunately, there's now a whole pile of reports on shelves gathering dust that say a lot of the things that we've all said today and that a lot of you will be thinking. So I think it's really critical that, yes, we can certainly enable communities to contribute to those processes, but we must be able to do something about what they tell us that's needed, and not just keep kicking the can down the road, as they say.
I was just going to add something, if that's all right, Charles. I'm a great believer in bottom-up, and I think there's a lot that we can learn from conscious community leadership, and the importance of developing, defining and forming a group so that it has an entity. As much as I'm slightly anarchic and I don't like structure, but I think that's really important. We've seen some really powerful movements over the year, like the Centre for Alternative Energy in Machynlleth. They've become, now they are really of the moment. I went there in the 1980s, and they were seen as bohemian, they were seen as different, but they were so progressive in what they were doing. Comrie Croft, they're doing some great work on sustainable living and ecotourism. And there's a community I know in the outback of Australia, in a place called Winton, and they've got 4 mayors that come together. They decide with the community how they spend the federal reserves that they are given and the state reserves that they are given. And they've developed some amazing things, like they found dinosaur bones, and so they are now one of the world leading expert areas in paleontology. They have, Waltzing Matilda was written in the town, so they've got the original piano that it was written on. So they have taken, with strong community leadership, creativity and vision, and forming a democratic process within their community, they have these really random, disparate things that Winton is famous for, which now includes an Outback Film Festival and an Outback Music Festival. They've just pulled their funding into things that mean something to the civic pride and to the people that live there. So I'm a real believer in fostering a Scotland that allows those communities to develop those leaders, to put forward those leaders. Because one thing that I do know, having spent time dealing with Westminster, is that we have a parliament that is very engaged and wants to listen to the community. And we may criticise them, but it's a damn difficult job, particularly after COVID. And they are open to us, and that is a really good start.
Before we move on, one of the questions that has been formulated across multiple questions that have been coming in, and I did pre-appraise the panel of this one beforehand, is that many, obviously within communities, there are people who work in sectors beyond those communities, or are not necessarily immediately as employers embedded in it, but they're subject to their own just transitions. And those just transitions will influence a community's vitality. For example, if people move away to new jobs in renewable jobs that may move them from particular areas. How do we address the challenges of multiple transitions impacting communities when those transitions are based on potentially on sectors, for example, oil or gas or agriculture?
Well, I don't think that's anything new in rural. It's a challenge that this has always been the challenge, and it's something that Jane was talking about rural proofing and taking place-based approaches and bringing it down a level to think about the local a bit more. And rather than thinking about it purely from the sectors, which has usually been designed with urban areas in mind, dare I say it. And then we have policies that are kind of fitting in, like Jackie was talking about, in terms of leader or that are designed to address the failures of what's happening in rural communities. So we need to keep just pressing on with this idea that we need to think about rural, and that rural is different and it faces inherent issues that are not faced in rural, and sometimes the cause of a problem in rural might be different. Around transport, for example, obviously there's just been an announcement of free transport to anybody under 22 in Scotland. Well, that's great if you've got access to a bus service, but for a lot of young rural people, that's not going to be the case. So it's always thinking about what these other issues might be, and the fact that they're not just relating to one thing, that they're cross-cutting, that people might want to come to have a job in an island, and they've got a job on an island, but they don't have the housing to go with it. So it's in rural, it's thinking about not just this one issue, but these multiple intersecting issues.
There's no one solution and one answer to either. But I'll maybe just think of some of the more traditional industries, agriculture, which is actually food industry. Some people forget that, and we all need to eat. When I was in the Parliament for a wee while ago, 2007, I thought, you'll get a chance of a members' debate, so what will I do for a members' debate? Public food, local food procurement. And great debate, and there are great examples of East Ayrshire, where 70% of the local authority was able to get their food locally. And if you look at places like Italy, they do this a lot. But the big barrier that came up there was to hide behind an EU rule, wrongly, that you can't bias towards local food. You have to be open to the whole EU market. Italy always got over that by stating what sort of varieties and seasonality and delivery methods were there. So there were ways around that. So and processing as well. The dairy industry has been in crisis several times and has a cyclical cycle. A cyclical cycle would be a cyclical cycle anyway. But if you look at somewhere like New Zealand, they've developed processing and marketing into Southeast Asia as a focus. Southeast Asia and New Zealand is quite some distance, so that's about like us marketing into Argentina, for example. So I think there's maybe a chance to, again, just rethink about how we can look again at some of those agendas that I think were stalled wrongly in the past, and look to see where we can add value, add jobs, and cut climate change at the same time, carbon use.
Yeah, and I think coming back to looking at rural communities in the whole, not having, as they would say previously, all your eggs in one basket is a good thing. So I think pluralism, both from an individual's point of view, which is a way of life in many rural communities, and maybe you do earn a little bit less, but maybe that's not why you've chosen to live there in the first place. If you're destitute, then clearly having 6 jobs is a challenge. But in other ways, having more than one job, and we saw this again in COVID as well, it engenders resilience. Resilience for an individual, and resilience if you have a mixed economy within a community. So I think that is really important, and as Jim was just saying, it does come back to what we want rural Scotland to do. Every single day of life there are 90,000 vessels on the oceans of the sea, and that includes cruise ships and other things like that, but the cargo ships are maybe 300 metres long, 30 metres wide, and weigh over 41,000 tonnes. 90% of our trade comes by ship. And yet, we can produce so much here and reduce the carbon miles. Who is counting those miles? When the Ever Given gets stuck in the Suez Canal, 50 ships going each way, when the Ever Given got stuck and halted all of that, every day there's 100 ships going through. Whose balance sheet of carbon does that go on? So we need to look at that and again look at the capacity within our own communities to have a broad base of resilience response. And COVID absolutely demonstrated that. In a way, the further away you were from the centre, and this was absolutely evidenced by the Northern Periphery report of peripheral areas, whether you were in Finland or whether you were on the Outer Hebrides of Scotland or Shetland, didn't really matter. Overall, that community resilience was stronger because just out of necessity, they were able to respond more quickly and respond to communities' needs. The Audit Commission and the Accounts Commission have just reported that government should be more responsive to communities because of their ability to respond quickly and in a more agile way than perhaps an urban context can. So in fact, rural, far from being on the back front, in some ways can lead. As I was saying to colleagues before, I was at the Northern Periphery annual conference last week. It was hosted in Ireland. We visited it online. My colleague Thomas was speaking at it. And the Irish host said, peripheral areas have been considered so far on the back foot for so long that they now find themselves ahead. And I'll just give you, for example, the island of Eigg. Eigg was taken into community ownership in 1998, I think. Somebody will correct me if I got my year wrong. And they had no electricity. They weren't on the national grid. Come 2008, they now have a mixed model of renewable energy. That is, if the stream runs dry, it's water, wind and solar. So whichever stops, they've got others. So again, I cannot emphasize enough that that mixed model underpins resilience, and many rural and island communities have had that generationally. This single focus, monocultured approach to anything, farming, industry, whatever, supported often, you know, the big employer and all that kind of thing, actually is not sustainable. You need a broad base. We all need that in our lives.
Thank you very much. And Fiona has just moved very nicely on towards our closing section, which is international Scottish examples where we can learn from rural communities that are leading on just transitions. I'll really open that up to the panel. Jane, you have the microphone.
I mean, I suppose in terms of Scottish examples, Eigg is a great example, and I think it goes back to some of the comments we were making earlier about the need to to scale up these excellent examples of where communities, perhaps with external assistance of one form or another, have taken on a whole bunch of challenges and tackled them in an integrated way. And one of them might be to do with climate change. Just going back to the OECD event on Tuesday, I don't know if anyone else was there, but there were some amazing examples in that, rural examples in that event. So there was the Danish example of Skiva, I think if I pronounced it correctly, which is a cluster, a co-location of businesses of all sorts. But they were working together, but very much embedded locally in that particular area. And it happened in that context because there was plenty of space to set up these different businesses, all of which were involved in net zero circular economy in some different ways, including if I remember rightly, a company that was using starfish that was in, I don't know, looking at Alexa, because you were there as well, I think, but using starfish from ballast water from ships to create organic protein, feed for animals, which was just an incredible example. There was the Autonomous Ireland Islands, where they were doing small-scale agriculture, recycling water, and using products from a snack company, I think, potato peelings, again, in a circular economy way. And also a Greek island that had traditionally relied, about 1,300 population, that had traditionally relied on a diesel generator, had a couple of very, very old buses that used to take people and local people and tourists around the islands, and they were rebranding themselves as a smart, sustainable island, using electric vehicles, starting to use solar power, wind energy, and just some really great examples. Obviously, you know, transporting that example into a Scottish context, or any of those examples, you know, at face value won't work. It needs to be locally tailored, but really quite inspiring examples from rural places elsewhere.
Thank you very much, Jane. We'll be getting close to the end now, so if,
Okay, well,
if
just
one or two examples can be...
Okay, just very quickly. Well, in Finland, certainly throughout the pandemic, it came out of the Northern Periphery work. They illustrated where they could do a deal with a local college to deliver home care training, which meant people who were working in a very agricultural sector could then be delivering home care. So this retraining and enabling people to work more closely, that was a really good example. A lot of their healthcare is digital, but home care obviously has to be delivered at the point of need in people's houses. And in Ireland, well, we can come on to that. We can talk about it later. I'll pass it on to other colleagues.
Thanks very much, Stephen. I'll try and be brief as well. I'm going to stay fairly local to where I was from, I suppose. And there's been some great work in Ettrick and Yarrow with their community development company, and also the Borders Forest Trust, which I mentioned briefly before, working together. So it's difficult to pinpoint which is with who, but Ettrick and Yarrow Community Development Council, they've got together to raise funds for an electric vehicle, a community bus, if you like. They've got cycles where you can all hire a cycle rather than having to purchase a one. So for addressing transport issues with the Borders Forest Trust, they've restored some marshland, made it all accessible for visitors to come along and obviously understand. The Borders Forest Trust do also a lot of work with community woodlands and community woodlands near schools and educating the kids near schools so they can understand the carbon cycle and sequestration. The Trust not just worked with those communities and also the schools, but also with businesses, and those businesses are called agriculture. There's often a fight between is that agricultural land or is that forestry land, and they compete in the market for purchasing or accessing that land, and that causes conflict. Work up in that area. At some stage there was some private forestry which had promised local jobs, and I was talking to a local farmer there and said, there's locals working there. I was talking to a guy who's local to Winnipeg, nothing wrong with Winnipeg, but it's not that local to Ettrick and Yarrow, just look at the map. So there's something there about how Borders Forest Trust managed to get some different funds in, but including carbon sequestration funds to put in some woodlands on farmlands without any sheep or cattle having to be put off, because if you do it in a clever way, it can actually benefit the land as well, so to manage your farm better. Shelter belts, for example. We have an issue which has been a bit of a thing for me for some time. Much of Scotland, a large part of Scotland, forget the percentages, but it's just a little under 50% is tenanted farmland. And if you have a tenancy, then quite often it's an agricultural tenancy where you have to farm sheep and cows and grain, which is all fine, but you'd be forbidden to actually plant trees. There's an easy way around it. You can have a tree which obviously takes, if it's a commercial tree, 40 years or 37 years, I think officially. I'll get corrected by RESAS to mature, but therefore, what's the issue when somebody leaves after 12 years? Well, you can do a WAGO where they get compensated or recognised for that. So I think there's a little bit there about not thinking agriculture versus forestry, but how they can be better integrated without that conflict.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, well, we are very short of time.
I'll keep it just very brief. One example, South Korea. And it's to do with the intention of funding. So a lot of the local authorities in South Korea are funding well-being as part of the solution, so not economic development. And I'll just share with you one community that we visited where the mayor of the town was 80, and he was 70, and he was one of the younger members of the community. And this community had a kitchen where they made tofu and they made other kimchi and other foods that they sold. But they were self-sustaining. They looked after one another. So all of the residents were over 70. And the purpose of that funding was not economic development, it was about social care. So we need to learn from some of these other communities elsewhere in the world.
I don't think we've got any time, but I'll just say smart villages. There's a network of smart villages across Europe. Scotland's part of that. We've got a smart village for young people, and I think it's a great way of pulling communities, both geographical and of interest, together within a digital portal and allowing information and interaction to happen.
And I was just going to end by saying that I think we're doing lots of great things in Scotland. Let's look, for example, at what's happening in Flotta, in Orkney, where they're trying to move from more kind of traditional carbon, oily stuff to greener energy, shall we say.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry to have to start to draw it to a close there. Before I do, once again, apologies to those who may have only just been able to manage to come in online. There have been huge problems this afternoon with online connectivity. And what we will do is, I say, we will hold the Slido open. We will use the recording of this video. We will put that out, and that will allow people online, and indeed who've been here in person, to address further questions, and we will respond to those with the willingness of the panel. I hope we'll do that, and we will do our very best to engage wider in this particular conversation. We've heard huge opportunities here today, and also some of the challenges that rural communities face in their route to net zero and in a just transition, but huge opportunities from cooperation, from involvement of youth, and of all the skill sets that exist within rural communities. Listening to that innate knowledge that is there, that's lived experience and knowledge that have been built up within them. And we've heard at the end of this session some of the examples that we can exemplify both within Scotland, but also with our across countries across Europe and internationally, as to the very best practice that we can learn from and develop a just transition across rural Scotland. Finally, before my thank yous, I'd just like to return to Corder Primary in Nernshire in Highland with a final question that we will do our very best to answer after this event. And this is around the initiative of the carbon dioxide changing bouncy castle that is on display at COP26. I personally didn't know anything about this. It seems a fantastic initiative. They think that one should be in every village and town moving around Scotland. We will make whatever inquiries we can about that. We can't promise anything, of course, but we will investigate and we will ask those questions for you. And thank you very much indeed for another challenging question from the pupils at Corder there. Finally, my thanks to Visit Scotland for coordinating and running the event. They've done a fantastic job in making it a delight to be here today. And I would like to thank my colleagues in Safari Gateway, Andrew and Michelle, who have done a huge amount of work to put this event together. And finally, to our panelists, whose expertise and knowledge has been, well, not just in depth, but extensive across rural Scotland. And I look forward to taking forward this work. We will prepare a report when we have all the feedback from it, and we will look to see where there are opportunities to engage with communities and those interested in policy development and policy delivery in those communities from the discussions that are coming out of COP26. So we will be taking this forward. And once again, my apologies to those online for the problems that they have experienced. They've been beyond our control. But thank you very much indeed for listening and taking part. And thank you once again to the panel. Thank you. Thank you. And we have, for those of us here, we have some light refreshments and a chance to meet with panelists.